There are moments in history where time does not pass, it holds its breath. This was one of them. A crowded TV studio, lights glaring like judgment, cameras fixed on two men, one, the host, young, sharp-suited, celebrated for his quick wit and sharper tongue. The other, Pope Leo XIV. Robed in white. Calm. Still. Timeless. The show was live. The audience expectant. The world was watching. The host leaned forward, lips curled with polite aggression. And then he delivered the question that had been sharpened backstage like a blade: does God still matter, in a world ruled by reason? A ripple of applause followed. Not loud, but smug. The kind of applause that doesn't come from agreement, but from mockery well-dressed as curiosity. Pope Leo said nothing. Not at first. He didn't blink. He didn't twitch. He just looked at the host. Through him. Past him. The seconds stretched, each one landing heavier than the last. Then he spoke. Only a world that has forgotten suffering would ask that question out loud. The studio went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that creeps behind your ears and whispers. You've gone too far. What followed next was no longer a conversation. It was a reckoning. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from. And still watching without subscribing? Then subscribe to God's Message for Souls. Before he was Pope Leo XIV, he was Robert Francis Prevost. A missionary with worn-out sandals and a weathered journal. He had crossed minefields without armor, entered gang-ruled barrios without an escort, and listened to the last confessions of children whose names the world never learned. He had knelt beside the dying not to save them, but to remind them they were not alone. He spoke 10 languages, but silence had always been his sharpest tongue. Where others preached, he listened. Where others demanded reverence, he extended dignity. And though the red robes of cardinals once seemed out of reach for a man who preferred sleeping on floors, the Church had chosen him, not for ambition, but for the quiet gravity he carried. When the conclave doors opened and the white smoke rose, it was not charisma that had elected him, but a certain moral inevitability. Now he sat beneath studio lights instead of cathedral ceilings. Cameras encircled him. But he was unmoved. Still barefoot within, though leather now covered his feet. Still carrying the smell of the wounded on his skin, though incense and protocol had tried to cover it. Across from him sat the host. Young. Ambitious. Brilliant. A product of the modern age and a proud evangelist of it. He had built his empire on skepticism, interviews where bishops stammered, debates where philosophers lost their footing. His show, unfiltered, was a ratings phenomenon, a place where belief came to die, and where laughter often served as the tombstone. He was not cruel. But he was confident. Too confident. Because for years, no one had challenged his throne, not in logic, not in poise, not in presence. And now, in a bold twist that stunned media outlets and theologians alike, he had secured the most elusive guest in the world, the Pope himself. The special was billed as a historic meeting of minds. Faith versus Progress, the title card read, its font bold and surgical, its background the pale blue of network neutrality. It was not just another interview. It was an event. Broadcast simultaneously in over 30 languages. Streamed across continents. Tweets fired before the first word had even been spoken. And though no one said it aloud, the unspoken question hung like incense in the air: would faith survive this encounter with the modern mind? For the host, this was a victory already sealed. For the Pope, it was just another room filled with souls. But the world leaned in. Because this was the first time in history that a sitting Pope had stepped willingly into the lion's den of secular prime time. Not to win. Not to argue. But to remind. Remind them of what? That had yet to be seen. But already, something ancient stirred beneath the studio's synthetic glow. The host crossed one leg over the other, fingertips poised together as if holding a fragile idea between them. He leaned in just enough to seem respectful, just enough to veil the blade he was about to unsheath. "Your Holiness," he began, voice smooth, measured, almost inviting, "why cling to faith in a world built on science?" It was the kind of question that earned nods from audiences and retweets from headlines. Not an attack, at least not on the surface. But beneath its polish was a challenge: you are obsolete. Prove otherwise. The Pope did not blink. He did not clear his throat. He did not flinch from the implicit suggestion that belief was a relic. Instead, he let the question settle, like dust on stone. And then he answered. "Because even science," he said, his voice a soft chord in a dissonant room, "bows to wonder." No one moved. Not because the reply was loud, but because it wasn't. It hovered. It unsettled. The host's eyebrows lifted just slightly, but he recovered quickly. He had debated Nobel laureates and theologians alike. He was prepared for poetry. Of course, but science has evidence. It has progress. Faith, well, faith has stories. The Pope smiled, not with amusement, but recognition. He spoke again. Gently. "And yet stories," he said, "built every civilization. It was not atoms that first taught us to love. It was parables. A father and a prodigal son. A shepherd and a lost sheep. Even your own show," he said, his gaze resting kindly on the host, "runs not on facts alone, but on story. Suspense. Revelation. Ending." A soft murmur moved through the room. The Pope had not raised his voice. He had not contradicted. He had simply reminded the world that even those who dismiss story, still live by it. The host shifted. A brief recalibration. Then a smile. "Fair enough," he said. "But isn't faith about certainty? And science, after all, thrives on doubt. Isn't doubt a better engine for truth?" Leo's eyes didn't harden. They softened. "Doubt is not the enemy of faith," he replied. "It is the doorway. But not all who walk through it are searching. Some," his eyes lingered just long enough, "are hiding behind it." Now the air grew heavier. The host leaned back, just slightly. Enough to betray the first hint of imbalance. He cleared his throat. "I'm just trying to ask the questions people are thinking," he offered. "And I am answering them," Leo replied, "as someone who's seen both microscopes and miracles. In war, I watched a boy hold his dying mother and ask, 'Where is God?' In that moment, doubt was not a theory. It was grief. And it was in his arms that God wept with him. No applause. No laughter. Just the quiet rearrangement of hearts that comes when a room remembers it has one." The host sat still now. Not stunned. Not broken. But, adjusting. Because what he had expected was doctrine. What he was getting, was witness. If you felt it too, subscribe to God's message for souls. Not for answers, but for echoes of what you've almost forgotten. The smile on the host's face returned, but now it was colder. Less amused. More deliberate. The kind of smile that didn't touch the eyes. The kind used not to welcome, but to corner. "Well, then," he said, tone crisp as winter glass, "let's talk about what people are really wondering." His fingers tapped against his chair arm. "Hasn't religion caused more wars than peace? And isn't the church, if we're honest, just a moral gatekeeper in a liberated world? Telling people who to love, how to live, what to fear." He paused, giving space for his words to echo, knowing the audience, some watching live, others through screens, were leaning in, nodding in silent agreement. But Pope Leo did not react. He did not lean forward. He did not stiffen. He did not defend. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if grieving what the question revealed more than what it accused. Then he answered. Faith, he said gently, didn't start wars. He looked directly at the host. Not as an adversary, but as a soul. Broken men did. His voice grew quieter, but heavier, as though the weight of memory sat beneath every syllable. And it was faith, he continued, that buried the bodies. That washed the wounds. That sat beside the mothers when the cameras turned away. The host opened his mouth slightly, but no sound emerged. Pope Leo's eyes, dark and ancient, stayed fixed. I once stood with a grieving woman in Aleppo, he said, the words now thick with the dust of memory. Her son had been pulled from rubble. Half his body crushed. She held his lifeless hand and whispered to me, where was God? The studio had stilled again. Not a whisper, not a shuffle. The Pope folded his hands in his lap. I told her, he said, he was right there, crushed with him. Now the silence was not tension, it was mourning. The host tried again, voice just above a murmur. But isn't that just something you say to make people feel better? Leo's gaze did not harden. But something in it turned to steel. No, he said. It is something I say because I was there. And I felt him weep through her tears. He straightened his spine, not as a man preparing to fight, but as one who refuses to bow to noise. God is not outdated, he said softly, but we often are, especially in our pride. The host sat still now. His notes untouched. The rhythm of his routine interrupted. He had not lost control, but he had lost certainty. Because somewhere between the question and the answer, something real had entered. And it had made no sound. The host's expression, once smooth and self-assured, now tightened at the edges. Something had shifted, and he knew it. The questions were no longer landing with the same confident snap. But he pressed forward, voice rising, not in volume, but in edge. So what you're saying, he challenged, is that morality needs God? That without your faith, we're lost? Isn't that manipulative? Using eternity as a leash? His tone sharpened, no longer veiled. Or maybe, he added, eyes narrowing just enough to sting, you're just another man in robes, claiming to speak for the divine. The moment trembled, delicate, electric. And Pope Leo did something rare. He closed his eyes. Not to retreat. But to remember. When he opened them, the room seemed smaller. As if every set light had dimmed without dimming. As if the world had folded in around what he was about to say. I've seen too much death, he said, to speak for applause. The words landed like ancient bells, low, echoing. I speak because the silence of truth is louder than mockery. And because I have stood beside too many people who waited until the end, to ask if God was real. He leaned forward, not as a weapon, but as a witness. There was a man once. Brilliant. Respected. He told the world there was no God. He wrote it. Taught it. Laughed at those who believed. A pause. No embellishment. Just memory. He was dying. I was called to sit with him, not as a pope, just as a priest. And in the final hour, his voice cracked. His hands trembled. And he whispered, I don't want to die alone. The room didn't move. Even the blinking red lights on the camera seemed to hesitate. Leo looked past the host now, as if speaking to something the eye could not catch. He asked me to pray. Not because he believed. But because he hoped. His voice dropped to a near whisper. And I did. Not because he deserved it. But because God never stopped waiting for him. Now the weight was unbearable. The host's shoulders shifted, almost imperceptibly. The questions on his lips dissolved before reaching his throat. Then Leo delivered the line, gently, but with the finality of a gavel. Mocking God is easy, he said. Until you need him. That was the breaking point. Not for the host. Not yet. But for the illusion that the show was still his. He had invited a figure of tradition to spar with reason. Instead, he had summoned a man who had walked through death and returned with silence too sacred to mock. The studio, once filled with the confident rhythm of a seasoned host guiding his domain, now felt hollow. Not empty, but stripped. Every spotlight, every camera, every chair seemed to exist only to witness what had just happened. The host sat still. But not in control. Something in his breathing betrayed him. Shallow, measured, too conscious. One hand curled slightly into a fist on his knee, grounding him, perhaps, against the ground that had quietly shifted beneath him. He reached for something, anything, to retake the space he had lost. So, he said slowly, voice brittle under its polish, you're saying, without God, I'm lost. His tone wasn't sarcastic now. It wasn't sharp. It was uncertain, naked with the kind of vulnerability that knows it's being watched. Pope Leo didn't rush to answer. He let the silence speak first. Then he replied, not with triumph, but with the kind of gentleness that disarms rather than defeats. No, he said, I'm saying that without God, you'll never know who found you. It wasn't clever. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the kind of truth that arrives quietly, without ceremony, and leaves an echo that doesn't go away. The host looked down. A flicker. A breath. The illusion of armor thinned. Then the Pope continued, not to destroy, but to clarify. You confuse visibility with virtue, he said, his voice calm, almost soft, but unrelenting. You assume that being seen means being right. That because something is loud, it must be true. But noise is not revelation. And applause is not absolution. He glanced toward the audience, not the cameras, but the souls. You assume logic is wisdom. But wisdom, he said, pausing as though weighing the word, begins with the fear of God. Not fear as in terror, but reverence. The kind that silences pride and makes space for something bigger than self. The studio grew tense. Not in conflict, but in reverence. Even the producers behind the glass walls sat motionless, eyes fixed. A camera slowly zoomed in on the host. His brow glistened now, not from heat, but from the weight of not knowing what to say. The Pope didn't press. He simply waited. And in that waiting, a dismantling occurred, not of the man before him, but of the scaffolding that pride had built around him. There was no clap back. No mic drop. Just truth. Carved slowly. Delivered without blade or shield. Just truth, unbending, unshaking, unafraid. This wasn't a debate. It was a revelation. Subscribe to God's message for souls, not because you agree, but because you just heard something your soul didn't want to forget. Still refusing to? Then answer this in the comments, what part of you keeps calling silence, weakness, just so you won't have to listen? The Pope's gaze drifted from the host. Not in dismissal, but in gentle release. As if he had never been speaking only to him. He turned slightly, slowly, until his eyes met the lens that stared back into millions of homes, into rooms dimly lit by screens, into hearts both skeptical and searching. And when he spoke again, his words no longer belonged to the set, nor to the script. They belonged to the world. This, he said, was never about him. The quiet in the studio deepened. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Even the cameras, as if aware of the holiness unfolding, seemed to zoom slower. It's about all of us, he continued. Every one of us who has traded reverence for noise, who has replaced worship with opinion, who has mistaken echo chambers for truth. His voice did not rise. If anything, it fell, lower, softer, deeper into the earth of the soul. What happens to a world, he asked, when we let noise replace reverence? There was no answer. Because everyone already knew. He stepped back. Not from confrontation, but into clarity. The world doesn't need louder arguments, he said. It needs softer hearts. The sentence hung in the air, not like a banner, but like a bell. Not demanding attention, but commanding silence. And then, after a breath, the kind of breath taken not from the lungs, but from the soul, he bowed his head. He raised his hand, not in spectacle, but in blessing. And over the studio, over the viewers, over the doubters, over the believers clinging by threads, over the weary, the proud, the ashamed, he spoke a prayer not for the powerful, but for the wandering. May the God you doubt, he said, still guide you home. No thunder. No applause. Just quiet. Sacred. Unfinished. As though something had been planted, not spoken. And somewhere in the silence, a tear fell. From whose eye, no one could say. But everyone felt it. And now the lights, once so commanding, began to fade in meaning. The cameras, still rolling, no longer felt like instruments of power, but of witness. Something had happened in that room. Not a debate. Not a spectacle. A revealing. The host sat quiet. No sign-off. No clever wrap-up. The man who once held the stage now simply remained. Not defeated, but displaced. And above that stillness, the narrator's voice enters, not loud, not dramatic, but present. As though a voice from beyond the room, watching with eyes that see deeper than cameras ever could. What would you have said, if you were in that room? Would you have nodded when the host smirked? Would you have clapped when he asked if morality without God was superior? Would you have leaned into mock, just a little, or would you have gone quiet, the way your soul goes quiet when something ancient is brushing past? Would you mock, or listen? Because at the edge of every argument is a decision. To defend noise, or to kneel before truth. This moment, this hour, is not about a pope or a host. It's about the stillness that followed. The shift that happened not in their words, but in yours. What did you feel? Not what do you think, what did you feel? Because perhaps, beneath all the reasoning and rhetoric, what this world fears most, is not God's silence, but that it's been speaking all along, and we stopped listening. So now the story ends, but not really. Because it has passed from the studio, into your hands. It is your turn. What will you say now? May we all seek truth with humble hearts, and never mistake applause for approval. Subscribe to God's message for souls, not for stories, but for soul awakenings. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Stay blessed.